What's going on, everybody? Mortym here, this time bringing you a look at the character creation in Pillars of Eternity 2. Now, obviously it starts out with male or female, so you can go from there. Then we come into our races. So if you happen to be unfamiliar with the races of Pillars of Eternity, they are Amawa, which are kind of like a coastal race. Navy's a big thing. You get +2 might if you choose one of them. Dwarves, they're dwarves. 2 might, 1 constitution, -1 to dexterity. Elves are, of course, just elves, pretty standard. Dexterity and perception. Then we have the godlike. They get a little crazy. Essentially, these are people who were touched by gods in the womb, and they represent the god they were touched by is how they look. Then we have humans, which is boring, and Orlans, which are, well, they're tiny furry people. So, every one of these races actually has a sub-race or several attached to them. For instance, if you pick the Amawa, you can choose island or coastal. Sometimes that changes their bonuses, not always. Usually it'll give you some sort of ability. For instance, they're not reduced to waiting when running through impediments. So island Amawa, they don't get slowed down by water and stuff. Coastal Amawa, they get resistance to might afflictions, things like that. So it pretty much always adds something. Dwarves, there's boreal and mountain. Elves have wood elf and pale elf. Godlike, there's actually a few different ones you can choose. There's nature, moon, fire, death. Now, an additional thing that these guys actually get that nobody else does, because godlikes can technically be of any race, even though they are also their own race. So, for instance, if a human is having a child and that child gets touched by God in the womb, like I explained, then they're still going to be of human proportion. So, essentially, you can choose an Amawa godlike size-wise, even though they're a fire godlike as well. So, it's just something to keep in mind. Humans get meadow, ocean, or savanna, which is essentially just skin tone and stuff. Orlans get hearth or wild, which, I don't really see the difference in them, but that's just because they're small furry people. So the godlikes actually have some of the most unique abilities as far as the subclasses goes, and they all just go through them at the bottom there, like you can see. So when you've decided which one you want to go with, then we come into our single versus multi-class. Now, single class, of course, focuses on one of the 11 classes. You get higher power levels, whereas multi-class, you can pick 2 of the 11 classes, and the catch is you will never reach the 2 last tiers of power in terms of the abilities and stuff. So what I actually recommend personally is making your main character a multi-class person and the rest of your party single, just because that way they're easier to manage. So just to show you the classes themselves, pretty standard kind of Dungeons and Dragons stuff. Barbarian, Chanter, Cypher, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Priest, Ranger, Rogue, and Wizard. Most of those do exactly what you think they do. There are a couple unique ones. Chanters essentially are bards. They sing stuff and it gives your party buffs. Ciphers are essentially mind wizards. Yeah, that's pretty much what they do. Most of their magic revolves around the mind and stuff. The rest are pretty much exactly what you think they are. Now, it's interesting that each and every one of these also has their own subclasses. So if I wanted to be a barbarian, I could not only be just a barbarian, I could be a berserker, which will either give me bonuses and penalties at the same time. So berserkers get, Frenzy gets the tenacious and hardy inspirations, which are buffs. And then they gain significant hit to crit conversion, but they're confused while frenzied, cannot see their health while frenzied, takes raw damage continuously while frenzied. Corpse Eater, you can essentially eat bodies. That's pretty standard. But all of your abilities are increased by 1 as far as their costs go. Mage Slayer gives you a bunch of spell resistance, so that one's a cool one. And if you want to see the abilities each class gets, you just come down here and click Preview Ability Tree, and it'll show you what's what. Now, let's say I want to be a Druid I can be an animist, which is kind of the standard druidy spells. Fury, which focuses more on storms and stuff. But the penalty being that I can't cast rejuvenations. Life Giver is all about the healing, but I can't cast summon creature spells. Shifter is all about turning into other animals, but I cannot cast regular spells. But let's say I want to be a shifter, then I can pick an ability that I want from that. And then I can choose a second class because I picked multi-class. Now this name over here in parentheses is the name of the class I choose if I choose that as the subclass. So if I choose Ranger, I'd be a Beastmaster because I'm also a Druid. Now, the key thing to keep in mind when you're doing these multi-classes is things that work really well together. So, for instance, a Stalker Ranger, essentially rather than being a ranger that uses a bow, you're going to be up close and personal. That way you're next to your pet, and you both get extra rating, armor rating and stuff from being next to each other. And then that goes really well with the Shifter Druid because, as you might imagine, if I'm shapeshift into an animal form, I'm up close and personal. That's more of a melee Druid focus. So those two go really well together. So you want to think about things like that when you're choosing your multi-class. So from there, again, if you're a ranger, you get to pick what kind of companion you want. They're all pretty cool, to be honest. And then you pick your starter ability from the class like you would anything else. Then you actually get to name your companion. So that's something I got to do here. And then we come into our attributes, which is probably the more important part. So might governs the effectiveness of everything damage and or healing wise. So might is your spell damage, it is your melee attack damage, it is your healing power. So very important. I would recommend like every single character you build needs might. I would make that at least 15, but obviously that's up to you. Constitution is probably fine at 10, especially if you're just on classic mode. Same thing for dexterity, of course, depending on, what you're playing. If you're playing a super rogue, obviously dexterity is important. So, I mean, if you've played any RPGs, you pretty much get the idea here. But the thing you want to keep in mind when you're picking these is that they will have real repercussions. If you've never played Dungeons and Dragons or basically any kind of RPG similar to this, what you're not going to realize is that all of these affect rolls in game. So let's say I have a 10 perception. I'm going to come across scripted events in the world, and if I choose an option that relies on my perception skill and it requires a perception check that is higher than my 10, then I'm going to fail that perception check, or it just won't be an option in conversations because I won't perceive what's going on. I won't have that. Same thing with intellect. I won't know something that someone's talking about. Or resolve, and then... So those are things to keep in mind as far as building a character. That way they can respond in the way you want them to respond. Another thing, however, is, of course, what those attributes actually do. Constitution makes up health, of course. Dexterity makes you faster and gives you more reflex defense. Perception gives you accuracy, which helps you hit things, and reflex defense. Intellect gives you will defense. It adds your area of effect damage to spells, as well as increases the duration of any ability. Resolve makes hostile effect durations last less on you and gives you defense. So from here, we pick where we're from. Now, essentially what this is trying to help you build your character. And if you're on Classic, just pick whichever one sounds the coolest. You honestly don't need to know much more than that. If you're trying to play on higher difficulties, this is actually kind of important because you'll get a +1 to a stat. And if you're playing on the Path of the Damned difficulty, every little bit matters. So you want to stack this where your class needs it the most. So a Deer gives you Resolve, Deadfire gives you Dexterity. It's however you pronounce that. It is also Resolve. Old Valia is Intellect. Rautai is Constitution. The Living Lands gives you extra might. And the White that wins gives you Perception. And again, those are just where you're from. So the Living Lands is obviously one of the best because that gives you just straight up damage. And then from there, you pick what your actual job was. And what these do is give you a point in some of the abilities that are outside of everything else. Think of them as kind of civil abilities, if you will, things you use outside of combat. So you pick your job, what you did before you were this. So we were a druid, so let's go ahead and say we were a hunter, which is going to give me one in survival, mechanics, and alchemy. And these are, this along with your culture are just extra things you can pull from in dialogue. So if I have a druid who's just, been a hunter all his life, and I pour points into survival, then he's going to know things about running around in the wild that somebody else wouldn't, and that's kind of how that's explained. And then lastly, we come up to weapon proficiencies. So weapon proficiencies, they don't actually matter, to be honest. That would be the nice way to put it. So essentially you pick these and you get an extra ability that you can use associated with that weapon that is okay. There is no penalty to not having these proficiencies and using that weapon. Like there's none at all. You're good to use it. There are also abilities in literally every tree that make every weapon a possibility. So if I want to be a fighter that has pistols, I can do that. If I want to be a druid that uses pistols or a gun, I can do that. The only thing you really want to do is go to your class tree and pick up the passive associated with that, and you're pretty much good to go. And then, of course, you have your customization. If you're unfamiliar with Pillars of Eternity 1, you can pick a portrait, the colors that are associated with your character, which will change some of your clothes, and that'll actually affect all of the armor and stuff you put on. You can actually change this stuff at any time during the game. This particular section is not static. You can actually just go to your character menu and change it. Besides the actual appearance part, the colors, the portrait, voice, and pose, you can do literally any time. The only stuff that's permanent is this customization section, which you do whatever you want there. And that's pretty much it. The last thing I am going to show you is I'm going to jump forward and actually show you some of the civil abilities, I like to call them, outside of the character creation menu, where I can actually show you the full list. Okay, so here we are at that active skill menu, or the civil ability skill menu that I was talking about. So you have the active skills, which are stuff that you can use, and largely they have effects outside of combat. And passive skills, of course, which also have stuff outside of combat, but these are mostly used in conversation. So you have alchemy, that will increase potency and durations of basically all the poisons and stuff you use. Potions, all that stuff. Arcana, in combat, it's essentially, it affects the scrolls and stuff, whether or not you have the ability to read those scrolls and use them in lieu of actual spells. Athletics, you get the second wind ability, which lets you recover health. Higher athletics increases the effects of that ability, and also it's used in scripted events to pass like physical challenges and stuff. Explosives is pretty straightforward. Essentially, you're just better at using bombs. Mechanics is actually what you would pick up if you want to be able to lockpick and disarm traps and stuff. Mechanics governs all of that. Sleight of hand essentially allows you to steal from people during conversations is the main one. As far as I know, it does not affect like pickpocketing or anything. I could be wrong there, but I haven't personally dealt with that. Stealth is essentially makes that character better at stealth. It's pretty straightforward. Essentially, your cone of detection will get decreased. You'll move faster in stealth, that kind of thing. And then you have all of your passive skills, which are bluff, diplomacy, history, insight, intimidate, metaphysics, religion, streetwise, survival. So most of those are for conversation purposes. They do great in conversations. During some scripted events, you can assign a character with these to do something for you. Like say you need someone to go check something out. You can send your streetwise guy to go look at it. Or you can ask somebody about their opinion on something, and if they have a history, points in history, then they might know something that the other characters don't know. And essentially it governs things in that way. So my cumulative knowledge to give someone here would simply be stack these buffs the best you can to make the character you want. But if you're on Classic, don't think about it too hard, especially if you've turned level scaling off. If you're playing Classic mode and you've turned the level scaling off, you can honestly just grind ahead of everything, and it's not going to be impossible to just beat the game that way. So I wouldn't stress yourself out too much. But if you're more of an RPG fan like myself and you want to try to play the higher difficulties, which are Veteran and Path of the Damned, it is important to stack these things and actually build characters that are effective at what they do. So just keep all those things in mind. I certainly hope you like the look at the character creation in Pillars of Eternity 2. If you did, I certainly hope you subscribe, but have a great day either way.